Hey everyone, and welcome back. This is the final session of this wonderful week of Procreate sessions. It's been a blast, and I can think of no one better to round off this event than the incredibly talented and lovely Nathan Brown from Trailhead. How are you, Nathan?
Hey, I'm good.
As ever, I love your backdrop. Every time I see it, it makes me happy.
Thank you. Thank you.
What are you going to be showing us today, Nathan?
Just finished a massive update on the Master Watercolor brush set and released it earlier this week. The set is now 148 brushes, and I'm extremely proud of it and very excited about it. I love to paint with it, and I want to walk through it today and then do a little walkthrough of a demo painting that I did of some floral painting, and hopefully everyone will have a better grasp on what's in the set and kind of how to use some of the brushes and become a little bit more familiar with the set.
Amazing. Well, without further ado, over to you. I can't wait to see this.
Okay. So what I have here is a new file. It's about 3,000 by 4,000 pixels, just to give you a sense of scale. I've got a watercolor texture. It's a paper texture. It's on the top layer and it's set to multiply. Now the set, it comes with some watercolor paper brushes we'll look at in a sec. But there's also 3 watercolor paper texture like JPEG files, high resolution, seamless textures that you can apply in your painting and then paint on top of them or over them. In this case, I've got this set to multiply and I'm painting underneath it. So, okay, the brush set itself is, the previous set was broken into 5 brush sets, and I've consolidated that to 3. So there's brushes, and there is washes, and there's splatters. Okay, so in the brushes set is the largest set, and it's where you're going to be painting from primarily. In this set, I included a sketch pencil, and it's the top brush. And then everything else below that is broken into sections. I tried to, because the set is so massive, I tried to split it up into sections so that the categorizing of brushes would make sense, so that when you're painting, you could quickly see at a glance, what you're looking for, and hopefully these little categories will make that easier. So the first set is what I would consider to be detail brushes. Now, these work great at small sizes for small details, right? Just like really fine stuff. But you can also scale these up and they work like the rounds. And you can do larger fills and larger shapes. Now, a lot of these brushes, this is what I'm most excited about. In the previous set, I was able to get the watercolor look I was after, but I felt like I had to work a little bit harder to achieve the look. I had to maybe like use the smudge tool to kind of smudge out some of the strokes. But these brushes, a lot of them will kind of sort of blend themselves with pressure, which is really fun and exciting.
Looks so realistic. Even just that bit.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun to paint with the set over the course of a couple of years and try to figure some of this out, try to figure out what works. And part of that was to figure out how to get these brushes to blend, more and more. So in the detail set, there's several brushes, and they have a little bit of different texture and a little bit of different the edge to the stroke. I think this one's got more of a wet edge, right? Okay, so then the next section is textured rounds, and it's the biggest section. Now, all of these brushes, I think they can primarily be used, to fill large shapes, like you would in a round brush in traditional watercolor, but the textures are different and the edges are different. So this, like for example, this one has less granulation than what this one does, right? And some of them are a little bit more blendable than others. Some are a little bit more smooth than others. And what my goal was really with the whole set was, I come from a traditional watercolor painting background, right? Just watercolor on paper. And all of this kind of stuff, all this variation can be achieved with one brush, right? You've got this one brush that you're painting an entire painting with, and you can do so much with that one brush. So that was kind of the challenge in building this set. I made it so massive because I wanted to try and capture all that you could do with traditional watercolor with one brush, because you can paint it dry, you can paint onto dry paper with a dry brush with more paint, you can paint with a wet brush into a wet area of the paper, and that creates a different look. So I wanted to try and make this set so that you could have all that variation, even though some of these brushes could be used for the same thing. Like if you're painting a bird, and you're painting along and you wanted to just check, you're painting the same type of area, and you just wanted to vary the stroke, with a traditional, you could do that with one brush. But here I wanted to give you that ability, but it's just with multiple brushes. Does that make sense?
It does, and I love how comprehensive your packs are. It really shows that you just live and breathe this in analog, and you just transfer every possible use of watercolor into a digital pack. It's amazing.
That was really the goal. And can you still see me?
Hold on, I'll focus on you, Nathan. There we go. So you're big now.
Cool. So this is the brush that this section emulates. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's so cool.
Okay. So this next section, right? The flat brushes. This is the brush. Can you see that one? Okay.
Yeah.
See how it's a flat blunt tip. This is the section right here, the flat brushes. That's the brush that these brushes try to emulate. The stroke is more blunt and flat, if that makes sense. It doesn't go to a fine point. Okay, so there's flat brushes. There's also a section of dry brushes which have sort of like the bristles are more visible, because the brush, in a sense, would have more paint than water. And this bristle brush, I don't know if you can see that or not.
Yep.
It's got these hard bristles, if you can hear that. That's the brush that this section would emulate. Okay. So the idea is there's more paint in the brush than water. Okay.
I feel like we're getting a ASMR experience as you're putting these brushes by the microphones.
Yeah. I have visual aid, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the next section is wet texture brushes. So in traditional watercolor, there is a method that is typically called wet into wet. You're painting with a water-soaked brush into a wet area of the paper. So the paper's not dry, it's wet, and paint tends to like bleed out into the water, into the wet area of the paper. So this is a section of brushes that you can paint, large shapes, large areas with, but the idea is that the paint is going to bleed a little bit. It's as if you are painting, and it's very transparent, right? So you're painting into a wet area of the digital paper, right? And they also blend really well in most cases. So you can, in the transparent, you can blend them. And there's quite a few of these. And again, some of them do kind of the same thing, or they can paint the same types of areas of your painting, but the edge is different or the texture is different, right?
So Nathan, I know you're going to demo these brushes in action, but in a broad sense, so people understand, when you're selecting the suitable brushes, what's your main consideration there between, a hard brush, a soft brush, etc.?
Well, it's really the level of detail and a question of texture. Because let's say if you're painting let's say a bird, there's probably areas of the painting that you want to have a sharper edge or a sharper focus. Because what happens is a brush like this, let's just say this brush is going to have less sharpness. Does that make sense? Like the bird's beak and maybe its eye and maybe the top of its head needs to be in fairly sharp focus, because it's the focal point of the painting, right? So that's usually, and then of course the level of texture. Those are usually my main considerations. So I have the set broken down in the ways I usually look for brushes, because I know that once I hit an area where I want to fill with a lot of texture, I'll go for these like stains and washes brushes. And these have a lot of variations, but the idea is that you can paint your own wash, your own background, or your own, um, uh, again, area where you would be painting wet into wet.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to take a look at real quick at some. Did I answer your question? Was that
yeah,
helpful?
totally.
Okay. Another area that in the main brushes set that I want to go over real quick, which I'm really excited about because I love texture. There is a method in traditional watercolor where you spray or you drip alcohol into wet areas, and it creates this reaction where the alcohol and the water don't really mix well, and it just creates this like wild bit of, let me get a darker color, this wild bit of texture. And then this is a pressure sensitive brush, so the harder you press, the more you just get this like wild looking texture. There's several of these, so you can vary it up. And it's kind of a mixture of like wash and splatter. And then of course there is another special effect in watercolor where you sprinkle salt in to a wet area, and it creates this sort of wild grainy texture. And I wanted to try and capture those. I had a little bit of those in the previous set, but they weren't as I don't know, dynamic and varied as in this set. I tried to add a little bit more variation in the new update. And really quick, let's look at the water brushes. Now, previously, these brushes had their own set in the last version, but just real quick, the idea of this is that you would paint with just water in the brush, right? So in traditional, you can have some paint on the paper. It's still wet, and you can use a brush that just has water in it to blend out the paint. And that's kind of what this set of brushes is for, is to just blend your colors out or blend them together, right? And the last couple of sections, we got the water, and then we'll have some watercolor paper textures, right? And you could choose a light gray, and you can just paint your own textures. Or you can use the JPEGs that are included. They both serve the same purpose, but you can paint in your own if you want, instead of importing the textures.
Very
and then
cool.
the last couple of sections here, the washes, there's just a large selection of just wet into wet washes. And I've got them kind of broken down as well into like stains, water washes, and light, smaller washes. And then some runs at the end that you could, if you added runs or splatters to these just stamp, right? They just, and they can get pretty big too. So these are really high resolution. You can make these really large. And they're they're just ways to add variation. And another thing that I really like about these is you can combine them. And I added so many because it's a good way to create variation in the painting. So like if this was your background, so you come in with like a smudge tool, or you could come in with one of the washes from the brushes section, and you could add to this, right? You could change it up a little bit. You could smudge it out and just sort of paint your own wash. And my favorite is the splatters, because I love to add a lot of splatters. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the painting. But I broke this down into sections too. So there's like heavy splatters. Let me change it to a darker color. There's some heavy splatters, which is just really dense. Oops, wrong one. Really dense splatters. and then really light splatters as if more water was mixed into the brush, right? So some of the splatters are transparent because there's more water in the brush than paint. And then I've also got some splatter painters in here so that you can kind of, this is kind of like the alcohol set where you can kind of paint these and just create some really wild textures. There's several of those. And then I've got paint drips where you can just like tap. You can just tap your brush and make just all these small drips or large drips.
It's like you've thought of everything. I love it.
I tried to.
And I'm such a sucker for the details. So like the drips and the splatters, I love them.
Yes, absolutely. I think splatters are just essential to watercolor because they just sort of add this finishing level of detail, and I think they're so important, and that's why I put so many of them in here, because not only is it it's fun to do traditional, like just dip and splatter and get drips on the paper. It's also really fun on the iPad because it's very much the same process. You're just kind of laying down these splatters and seeing what happens. And there's this thing in traditional watercolor that it's like happy accidents. The watercolor paint, some of it kind of paints itself through happy accidents. I don't know if that's the right term for it, but that seems to describe it.
That's like the Bob Ross term.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we're going to look at a floral painting that I did with the set, but I want to show you real quick. There's a couple of methods that I use to paint the petals and the leaves, and I want to show you on this blank piece of paper kind of what I did, just so you'll know when we get over to the painting, you'll know how I did a couple of the elements within the painting. So one thing is leaves, and there's a couple different ways that I would paint leaves. Let me switch to a green color so we can get a good leaf color. I would do a couple different things. So I might start with a selection, and just paint a leaf with a selection. And you can use the washes and just kind of drop in some color, and maybe you could even vary it up for maybe there's a yellow highlight. And you could paint over that. Let's go back to green with maybe, let's go to like a texture brush and just do something like that. And it just creates this variation of color and texture, right? If you undo the selection, now one thing about this method is yes, we've painted a leaf, but it does create this really sharp edge, which watercolor doesn't really have. So one way I would vary that up would be to take the eraser and choose a brush that like this loaded into wet in the detail section. It's got a really rough edge, right? So you could go back and you could erase some of this, right, to create that edge that watercolor has, and just create this rough edge leaf. And so that's one method that I would use. And then you can switch it over to Alpha Lock, which only paints within the painted area of the layer. And you could just add a little bit more variation. Like you could add maybe another wash if you darken the color a little bit, and maybe just add another wash in there just to add some variation. Now, another method that I use, which is really similar, but it creates that rough edge right off the bat. It would be to just take one of the round brushes or one of the detail brushes and then just paint your leaf, right? Something like that. And then on that layer, you could do the same thing, right? You could switch it to Alpha Lock and maybe go with, maybe get one of the wash brushes. Maybe that one looks pretty textured. Whoops. That one's pretty subtle. Let's try another different one. Let's try this one. Yeah, and just kind of add some
It looks
Very-
like sage.
Yeah. Just add variation that way. Now, another thing to do here that watercolor tends to have is a bit of a darkened edge. So you could come in with one of these brushes and just try to like darken the edge a little bit. That's pretty subtle. Let me try a different brush. I like the wet into wet brush a lot. There we go. Just kind of darken around the border. I'm just painting outside the leaf and darkening in the border. And you could also, if you wanted, you could throw in some splatters that would fall inside the leaf itself, something like that. So that's the method that I used in the painting we're about to look at. I just wanted to show you on a separate paper, just that was real clean, that we could just look at it. Look at those two methods for creating like the petals of the flowers and the leaves. So let's look at the painting itself. Does that make sense? Does those two different processes make sense to do the same, two different ways to do the same thing?
Yeah, I think they totally do.
This is the painting that we're going to be looking at.
Wow, look at that.
Yeah, you can see the leaves and the flowers. Now, if I tried to show you those methods within this painting, I think it would have been kind of difficult. I wanted to show you separately so that you could kind of see clearly how these were done. But now in the painting, I'm going to show you all the different processes I use to sort of blend these elements together so that it's like one cohesive piece.
Amazing. By the way, everyone said they're following along completely fine.
Cool.
And Sam, who's one of our favorite community members, just said, "Holy wow, that looks amazing." So everyone's loving this piece.
Nice. Okay, let's break this one down then. Let's go back out and let's start to look at it from a sketch. Now, this is the original sketch that I did. I did this with the sketch pencil that's included in the set. And this was my initial idea. I kind of wanted this long stem and this one single flower. But the thing about I've found with like floral type pieces, it's really a study in composition, because you've got to have this really nice composition. I mean, you can paint the most beautiful flowers, but if it's not composed well, it kind of falls apart, right? So I wanted to kind of to build on this, and I ended up changing the composition as the painting progressed, and I'll show you why in just a sec. Okay. So I started with a selection, okay, and this is a white selection that I drew it out with the, just like we did previously, just drew a selection around the petals and filled it with white. I'm going to turn down the sketch just a little bit. Okay, and then I filled in the background with a blue wash. Now, I took a couple of wash brushes from the wash section, and I stamped in a couple of drips and a couple of washes in just this one blue color for the background. I layered a couple and I blended a couple of them together. I also took a smudge tool. I used the water and I pulled in a downward direction to make it look like the water is pulling the paint down, if you can see that towards the bottom. Now, I also added a yellow wash behind that. And the reason I did that is because I knew I wanted this painting to be two colors, two complementary colors. And that was all I wanted to use. I wanted to try and keep it simple with just two colors. So I've got a blue wash and a yellow wash. And then because contrast is so important in watercolor, and I've already got this white flower, I wanted to start adding some darks. And I did this with a combination of washes and wash brushes and the smudge tool, again, because I started smudging around the edge of the flower. And I started creating contrast with that dark color and the white of the flower petals. Does that make sense?
It does, and I've always loved this use of like negative space with the original paper in watercolor. Right. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and in traditional watercolor, I think this is called negative painting, when you're painting around the subject. Like you can do it by not painting any water within like the flower petals or the leaves, or like masking it off using like a frisket or tape or something that would just mask off and keep paint out of the area. But with watercolor, it's very easy because you just do it with a selection or with digital watercolor. Okay, so next up, I added a dark wash just to kind of further smudge out my shadow areas. And I started adding a little bit of the detail in the center of the flower using one of the detail brushes and just kind of getting in some of that center. I don't know what that's called. There's a scientific term for that. The center little textures of little flower bits in the center. So I added a dark wash. Oh, and I began to smudge. In the next step, I began to smudge out the border of the flower. I just wanted to I didn't want those hard edges, or I didn't want so many hard edges in the flower petals. And next up, I added the leaves. Now, I'm going to turn the sketch off because this is where I started to abandon the sketch, and I'll tell you why. Because once I started to lay out the leaves, the composition began to look a little bit disjointed to me. And I found that I ended up using this sort of triangle composition. And triangles when you're thinking of composition, a triangle is always a good fallback, a good default. A triangle composition always tends to kind of work. So when you're having trouble trying to figure out composition, I find that a triangle is a good fallback. Okay, so that's why I moved my leaves around, because I painted the leaves within the sketch, but then I ended up selecting them and then just kind of moving them around, which is one of the many benefits of digital painting, is having the ability to say, well, that doesn't look right, and then you just move it all around.
Nathan, I love this piece, and I know we're not done yet, but I am loving it, and I love how it's pretty different from some of your pieces that you've shown before. I think it just shows the variety and the versatility of these brushes and watercolor as a medium.
Well, it's interesting because I don't paint a lot of florals, but I like it, especially with watercolor. And it was interesting to me because it ended up being a real study in composition. It was like, I hit a couple of points. I was thinking, well, why is this not working? But then it clicked in my brain, like, oh, this is all about composition. Like, it doesn't matter what I paint, as long it needs to be arranged in a way that is pleasing to the eye in order for the entire painting to work. So imagine, like, if you had multiple flowers in this piece, I mean, you would really have to adjust the sizing and the placement to get it to look, it would become a more complex composition. Okay, so next up, I painted some yellow. I went back to my second color and painted some yellow within the flower petals. And I just used one of those wash texture brushes, and I just blended it out a little bit with the smudge tool. And then one of my favorite areas to paint are the highlights. So I added some white highlights and yellow highlights in the leaves. And really, I just tried to think about where the light might be falling. I didn't have any reference for this. I was just kind of trying to wing it, which is always kind of scary. But I was just trying to imagine like, where the light might fall, and just kind of try to just brighten up some of the highlight areas. And then my absolute favorite thing to add is, of course, splatters. Now, I have this theory about splatters that I think rings pretty true. In watercolor, there is a variation of edges, right? There's like soft edges, and there are hard edges, and there are lost edges. And I think you kind of have to have all of them. You definitely have to have at least two of them. And I think what splatters do is it almost like it's like it brings it into focus, right? Because it adds all these little areas with hard edges. And I'll show you what I mean. So like this area of this leaf would be a hard edge, that line right there. And there's a little bit of hard edge here. And then all of these splatters create these nice hard edges, right? So then right over here, we have this sort of soft edge because it's made up of these multiple edges, and it just kind of softens out. And then right here, some right here, and then some over here are these blended lost edges, a little bit right there too. That might be a little tweener between soft and lost, where the colors, they blend together and there's no real visible edge. And it brings the softer the edge, or the more lost it is, the more it goes to the background. And the harder the edge, the sharper it is, the more it comes to the foreground. So in this example, there's a lot of hard edges right here. And that's probably the main focal point of the piece, right? Because that's where most of the hard edges are. So that's where your eye is automatically drawn to. Now, there's a couple of compositional elements too, and I could have probably emphasized it more with these bottom leaves, but a lot of these leaves sort of point in towards the center to draw your eye into the center. It's another compositional element. But does the edge theory make sense? Does that make sense to everyone?
It does, and I think you often do it more optically, right, as opposed to playing by the laws of physics or whatever. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It's not an exact science. You're just kind of using your judgment to see what looks good.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, just looking to, see, like, maybe you don't understand why, your eye is not being drawn to what you intended. Maybe it's, if you're painting a cat, maybe it's the cat's eyes. Well, it may be that, the whiskers and the hair and the ears are a little bit too in focus, so you might soften some of those edges and sharpen some of the edges in the cat's eyes to draw your attention into the eyes. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Light splatters. Now here it's almost as if the piece becomes even more sharp because I'm adding some of these subtle, lighter colored splatters in. So it's almost like the piece just becomes a little bit sharper. And then last but not least is an overlay layer, which I really like. I really like overlay layers because it just adds a little bit. It's subtle, but it adds a little bit of a highlight. And what I did on this overlay layer is I took a few of the stamped wash brushes, and I stamped a couple of darks and a couple of light washes at a smaller size. And just like I did a dark down in this area, and I did a couple of the lights up here in this area, and then darks over here, so that like these areas here would be more shadowed, and then these areas up here would be more, they would be receiving more light. So that's why you can see a little bit in the layer itself. You can see where the light washes have been added and where the dark washes have been added. And in the dark washes, I just use the same wash because you can't really tell because it just kind of blends in with everything else.
Love it. Marie says it's amazing how much dimension the splatters add.
Yeah, absolutely. Dimension is a really good word for it. Yeah, it really creates, and I think it's because of the sharp edges. When you add those sharp edges over a blurred background, like you can see it right here. Mm-hmm. You can see it right there, and then right up here too. It just adds this level of, I guess, just focus. And yes, dimension is a great word for it. I'm going to use that term. Dimension.
That splatter, the top left one, that reminds me of some of those Photoshop effects where it's like a particle, where you get subjects that dissolve.
Absolutely.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
Also, Nathan, I think there's a few people following along at home as they learn. And Natasha just said, I'm definitely having an expectations versus reality moment here on my canvas. What words of support can we offer Natasha?
Well, I'm gonna say this. And I was just about to mention it, and I think it totally applies. Is two things really. Okay, first, there's no hard rules. I mean, I'm giving you all these theories and everything, but there are certainly no rules. So don't set an expectation for yourself that is unrealistic based on your experience. Like if you've painted several florals, the second one's going to be better than the first one. Third one's going to be better than the second one. So don't get frustrated. Don't lose hope over your painting, right? Because it's just a matter of playing and experimenting. And the second part of that is, these brushes allow for a lot of experimentation. So don't be afraid to throw some splatter in. It's digital, so you can undo anything, right? So in these splatters, I might have thrown down 5 or 6 and just undid them because it wasn't quite right. So be patient with yourself and, experiment and try to allow for some of these happy accidents to happen. I mean, you were mentioning this, the particle explosion thing here was kind of a happy accident, right? I was just putting down some splatters and then, that works, right? That visually is visually pleasing. I'm going to leave that one.
That's half the fun of it, right?
Absolutely. You're exactly right.
Happy accidents.
That's why I say splatters and washes are my favorite thing, because those create the real happy accidents and the real, I'm putting this down to see what happens. And if I don't like it, I'll take it away. Oh, and I wanted to mention this too. The very last thing I did was I did a color balance to kind of balance out all the colors. And the way I did that was, if you swipe with 3 fingers, you can do this copy all, and it copies the paper texture and everything. And I loaded that onto a new layer above everything else. And then I did a color balance on the whole layer. And I just adjusted some of the midtones, and I pushed some of the shadows toward blue. And I think I pushed a little bit more cyan, and I pushed a little bit blue away from yellow, just to kind of harmonize everything. I usually do that with most of my paintings, just to kind of, even though I'm being intentional with the color, I still like to do a little bit of a color balance because it just kind of blends everything real nicely. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And
Cool.
Again, I don't mean to keep drawing parallels to Photoshop, but it's kind of like when you put an adjustment layer over the whole piece, suddenly the fact you had all these layers, that final one ties everything together because it kind of unifies the colors.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and a lot of times, I will paint, but I'll combine layers. Like I left all these separate layers so I could show you what I was doing, what I was thinking in this piece. But a lot of times I will combine a lot of the layers just because it makes things easier to blend, makes colors easier to blend. Like in this area right here, if you wanted to blend that yellow and blue a little further, if they're all on one layer, or if you wanted to lose the edge of this leaf, you could blend it real easily if it was all on one layer. This brush set has really just been my baby for like the past couple of years, because watercolor is something that I just absolutely am super passionate about, and I love it, and I wanted the experience to translate over to the iPad. The real sense of painting traditionally, and it's been really fun to try and unlock that, right? To try and figure that out. And I hope it comes through, and I hope that people love these sets of brushes as much as I do. They're just a lot of fun.
They're so much fun. And what did you say before? I love the wording of it. You're like, it paints itself kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. It paints itself in a lot of ways, especially, when you're using the washes and you're using the splatters and you're doing some of the different effects. It does sort of have a feeling of painting itself. And you have to kind of embrace that part of it, right? You have to kind of look for that and realize that that's kind of how traditional watercolor is. You have to kind of embrace the fact that watercolor is going to run all over the place and it's going to do its own thing, and that's kind of that's part of the fun of it. So you definitely have to embrace that aspect.
Nathan,
yes.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. In fact, should we stop the screen share? Let's welcome you back. There he is, everyone. As always, you just inspire me so much every time I watch you work. I just want to go hole myself away somewhere and just paint watercolor.
That sounds like fun.
It does. It certainly does. No, it's always so fun watching you work.
Oh, thank you.
No, that was so good. Thank you. We really appreciate you joining us and wrapping up this Procreate event. I just want to shout out again, check the shiny green button below our faces if you have not checked out this pack. The update alone is just so much value. And there's also several of Nathan's other best-selling packs available. We can't wait to welcome you back soon. Thanks again, my friend.
Come back, man. It's always such a good time. Really. Thank you so
much.
Love it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we'll see you really soon, and thank you again.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Bye, man.